Okay, I'm going to see if my technology works. Are we set? Well, the biggest success I've had is that I've managed to acquire a daughter-in-law who's a graduate of this fine college. So that's one of the best things that's happened to me this year. So one of my sons married her earlier this year, and they're now in San Diego. Well, I'm going to be addressing religion in Asia. So all the speakers at this conference got assigned topics, and some have done better at sticking to their assigned topics. And I'm not sure I will. I'm doing my best, so I'll do my best. But these are the questions that I'm going to try to answer. And I'm a quantitative sociologist, so that means I do a lot of numbers. And if you deal with numbers in today's world, it's just overwhelming because there's more data produced, in a second today than was produced for centuries and centuries in the past. So I'm going to begin though with a couple warnings about data. So one of them is attributed to a British Prime Minister from the 19th century, Benjamin Disraeli, and I've had this quoted at me, so I figure since people have used it against me, I might as well be honest and give it to you. He said there's three kinds of lies, and maybe you know these. There's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics. So I'm going to be sharing with you the third kind of lie today. And the other is that this comes from my grandson, 3 years old, and he has a good riddle that describes the danger of numbers. And this, of course, all of you will know this, and he delivers the joke better than I do. But I shared this joke. I was just with him in Italy and did this for a group of Italians. And, of course, they had never heard it, so they thought it was really funny. But anyhow, my grandson has a joke or warning about numbers. And this is why my grandson knows the danger of numbers. This is what his father does. So my son is a physicist, and he just had a paper published with this title, Continuous Wave Biexciton Lasing at Room Temperature Using Solution Process Quantum Wells. And I know nobody, if you know what that means, you're in the wrong room today. So my 3-year-old grandson, Jack, here in the green shirt, which on the left, so he says, well, here's the joke. Why is 6 afraid of 7? Yes, because 7, 8, 9. For those who have never heard that, and if you're not a first language speaker, 7, ATE, 9, 8, 9. Why is 6 afraid of 7? Anyhow. So numbers are dangerous. They can be very dangerous. They can be cannibalistic. Well, with that, I'm going to share with you some data today. The data that I'll be sharing, much of it comes from the Pew Templeton Global Religious Futures Project, and then in my new position, added analysis comes from the work I'm doing with the foundation. So a few data teasers to get you a little bit interested in Asia. So Asia is the world's religiously most diverse region. It's 2.2 times more diverse religiously than North America. And half of the world's countries with very high religious diversity are in Asia. And getting to the economic connection, GDP growth, so that's gross domestic product or economic growth, is 2.5 times higher in countries that have very high religious diversity than the world as a whole. So those are just a few teasers. But since I've mentioned diversity, how do we measure diversity? Or how do we have to begin by measuring religious diversity? So the basic way that in the work that I've done, and that Todd Johnson is involved with as well, and some of the publications, many of them were co-authors on, basically we just ask somebody, what's your religion, if any, and then that's how we measure religion. That works for many religions, but not all. So some don't even recognize it is a religion, like folk religion, and so then we have to get at that through practices and beliefs and not just self-identification. Well, this research has looked at more than 2,500 different surveys and censuses, and what we found is that more than 8 in 10 people today have a religious faith, and even among the 16% who don't, many of them have religious beliefs or religious practices. For instance, in the United States, among about 20% of people who have no particular faith, 68% of them in surveys report they believe in God. So in terms of broad religious groupings, Christianity is the largest, making up about 1 out of every 3 people in the world today. 74% of Christians today live outside of Europe, and that's a huge change from 100 years ago when 75% of Christians lived inside of Europe. Christianity is no longer a European religion. 150 million Christians live throughout Asia, and Asia is home to the 5th and 7th largest Christian populations. The 5th largest Christian population, this is a test. What country in Asia has the 5th largest Christian population? And it's not China. No? Right. And the 7th largest Christian population lives in China. Yeah, so 2 very large. And Feng Gang Yang today suggests that China will become number 1 before too long. Well, China is already number 1 in a number of things that I'll get to. Islam makes up the 2nd largest world religion. About a quarter of the world's people are Muslim today, but it's not in the Middle East. 80% of Muslims live outside of MENA, the Middle East and North Africa. 62% of all Muslims live in Asia. So Islam is an Asian religion, not a Middle Eastern religion, if you go by where they live. About 87 to 90% are Sunni Muslims. The religiously unaffiliated, you could consider as the 3rd largest religious bloc. They're not necessarily a group. But as you can see by the bubbles, most of them live outside of Europe. 12% of the religiously unaffiliated live in Europe. But the largest share live in Asia-Pacific region, and most of those live in China. 62% of all people who say they have no faith live in China. So China is number 1 already in the religiously unaffiliated, at least by these measures. Well, what's the future of the religiously unaffiliated? Well, you can get at this a little bit by looking at demographics, something I do a lot of. And this chart shows you the median age of religious groups around the world. And the unaffiliated are 34 years old on average. Compared to the global median, it's much older. And compared to Hindus and Muslims, this huge gap. Muslims are 11 years younger on average than the unaffiliated. So age matters, because even if all women in the world would have the same number of children, if the population is younger on average now, that means there's more women in those age groups who are going to have children, because the older groups, women are already out of their childbearing ages. So just by demographic momentum, Muslims will grow the fastest, Hindus second, Christians third. The unaffiliated will really become a shrinking size of the world's population. So the future of the world will become more religious, not less. And we have a paper submitted to a journal called Science that's looking at projecting the future of the world's religious groups, and we really see that the world will become more religious, taking into account conversion as well. Hinduism's the 3rd largest faith group, or the 4th if you count the unaffiliated, making up 15% of the world. Almost all Hindus live in Asia. 94% live in just one country, India. Buddhism is the next largest, and again, 99% of Buddhists live in Asia. And of course, China is number 1. Half of all Buddhists live in China by our estimates. 244 million people in China, we estimate, are affiliated in some way with Buddhism, and that makes China the largest Buddhist population in the world. Folk religions, these are local faiths that aren't connected to any larger faith and mostly practiced in a local, individual locale, number about 405 million people. Most people affiliated with folk religions live in Asia, and 73% of all people practicing folk religion live in China, so China again is number one in folk religion. Other religions taken as a whole make up only 1% of the world's people, and most of them live in Asia again, so Asia is coming out on top for a number of faiths. Judaism, though, numbers only 0.2% of the world's population. Statistically speaking, almost no Jews live in Asia. Some do, but not many. 10% live in Europe, and 82% live in the US and Israel, and it's hard to know which one has the larger population. Another way to look at these same data is that the overall global population is predominantly Asian. So that's where the future of the world lies. 58.8% of people are Asian, but the largest share of Hindus are Asian, the largest share of Buddhists are Asian, the overwhelming majority of folk religionists are Asian, other religions taken as a whole are predominantly Asian, the unaffiliated are predominantly Asian, Muslims are about equal to their share, but still 62% Asian. Only Christians and Jews are not predominantly Asian. So you can see a little bit why Asia is considered the world's most religiously diverse region. So, but how do I measure religious diversity? Todd Johnson's presentation earlier today talked about a variety of ways we can look at religious diversity, but I just look at it numerically, and there's pluses and minuses to that. So taking Indonesia, the world's most populous, has the world's largest Muslim population, is 87% Muslim, 10% Christian, 2% Hindu, and then smaller populations of Buddhists and a few others. But diversity, by this measure, doesn't reflect pluralism. So at least the way I'm using those terms, diversity, I'm using it just as a numerical concept. But pluralism is really the situation in a society where you have a variety of faiths and different versions of the same faith playing an active role in the community. So you Sunni and Shia, Catholics and Protestants. Here in Indonesia, all kinds of different faiths are present and have a role in society. So in a sense, diversity doesn't really measure this. That's a different thing that I'm going to measure. I'm just talking about basic numbers. So if you look at the world's religious diversity, these are the same numbers I've just gone through, 30, almost a third are Christian, a quarter are Muslim, and so forth. But if you now switch and look at countries, the world's most religiously diverse country is Singapore. And so this chart, you can see it has 18% Christian, 14% Muslim, 16% unaffiliated, 5% Hindu, 34% Buddhist, 2% folk, 10% others, and very few Jews in Singapore. So that mixture represents the most diverse country in the world, taking into account these 8 major religious groups, not subgroups within them. That's an example of very high religious diversity. An example of high religious diversity is a country that has just about 2/3 of one group, and then the third split between maybe 2 other groups. So that would be a high concentration. Moderate would be the US, about 3/4 of people or more belonging to one faith, and then a quarter split between 1 or 2 other groups. And then low religious diversity is when you have 90% or more of one faith and maybe just one other faith represented, such as in Egypt. So in terms of levels of religious diversity by region, Asia Pacific has the highest, with a mixture of various faiths. 7% of Christians, for instance, live in Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa has the second highest religious diversity, but it's largely split between Muslims and Christians. Europe has the third largest, but mostly split between Christians and the unaffiliated. North America is about like Europe, but it has fewer Muslims and more Christian population. Latin America and the Middle East and North Africa are the least religiously diverse regions of the world. So thinking of religious diversity, the 10 countries with the highest religious diversity, of them half are in Asia, and half are in sub-Saharan Africa, and none are anywhere else. So those are the two you can see from the countries, and this is in order of religious diversity. Those are countries with very high religious diversity. So China is one example, looking at the three most populous countries. There's diversity within Asia. And China's undergone massive change. During the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, all public religion was stamped out, and they were all forced to be unaffiliated. Of course, people secretly believed. But today, China is about half religiously unaffiliated, but then large populations of others, including the 17th largest Muslim population. It has a population of Muslims about equal in size to Saudi Arabia, and a little bit larger than Yemen's population. India is the second most populous country in Asia, and it is a bit less diverse. And then Indonesia is the third most largest, and it has low religious diversity. So in the world, China has more religious believers than any other country except India. So China is a very interesting case study of a country split between people involved in religion and people not. Well, one other factor that's important to know about religion and religious diversity in Asia is that there are millions of people moving around Asia. So this is millions of people. 5 million people born in China live in some other country in Asia, in Australia, or they live in India, or they live in the Philippines. So there's a lot of movement of people within Asia, and when people move, they also take their faiths and beliefs with them, or even adopt new faiths and beliefs when they move. Bangladesh, India, these are large populations of people from these countries now living in other Asian countries. Perhaps many more might move to outside of Asia, but within Asia, we have millions and millions of people moving around Asia, adding to this religious diversity. And this becomes security concerns when some of these people, like from Afghanistan, 3 million Afghanis are now living in other countries within Asia, raises concern, are they taking with them some of Taliban, Al-Qaeda thinking as they move around? So then that raises even a question, is religious diversity dangerous? Well, one way to answer that is to look at countries with very high social hostilities involving religion. So that means countries where you have a lot of religion-related terror, a lot of hate crimes based on religion, religion-related war, prejudice, and so forth. So the countries that have the highest social hostilities involving religion are on this list. So are they diverse or not diverse countries? So here you can see Pakistan leads the list, and the lighter the color means the less diversity. Pakistan has low religious diversity. Afghanistan, low religious diversity. India, only moderate religious diversity. Somalia, low. Israel, moderate. Iraq, low religious diversity. Palestinian territories, low. Syria, low. Russia, moderate. And Indonesia, low religious diversity. So just looking at these 10 countries, the countries that have high social hostilities involving religion are not very diverse. So religious diversity, at least by this way of looking at it, is not associated with danger or social conflict, but it's the attempt or the situation where you just have a majority faith dominating the landscape that tends to be more related to social hostilities involving religion. Another way to answer the question whether religious diversity is dangerous is to look at whether or not countries with high diversity are how they're doing economically. And of the 10 countries with very high religious diversity, all of them, without exception, have had higher than world average GDP growth, economic growth, over the 5-year period from 2008 to 2012. So from a social science perspective, we should see some random distribution. You know, about half of them should have above the world average and half should have below the world average if it was just sort of no relationship. But it's very interesting that all the countries with very high religious diversity had better economic performance. Well, I'm not making a case that religious diversity is in itself a value, but it's important to just look at and see that religious diversity in and of itself is not associated with bad, violence or poor economics, and in fact, it might be something different. Well, China is a big topic. China is a big country, and during the Cultural Revolution, all religion was attempted to be eradicated. But compared to other countries, China has some of the harshest restrictions on religious freedom of any country. And so the case of China, religious diversity and religious freedom is a little bit complex, but perhaps one way that is, I think, fair to judge China is against itself. So going from a situation where essentially all religion was eradicated to today, where faith is now openly practiced by many, many people in China, and having a very religious diverse population with the largest populations of folk, Buddhist, and Taoist populations in the world, the 7th largest Christian population, the 17th largest Muslim population, is some indication of China and the changes. So if not religious freedom, China has certainly experienced an explosion of religion in the past 30 years. Well, this chart looks at two measures that I've developed at when I was at the Pew Research Center that you can judge religious freedom broadly defined, these social hostilities involving religion, going up the scale, and then coming across the page to the right are government restrictions on religion. And so countries that have very high government restrictions are up in the top right, and I don't think you can read those, but it's Russia, Egypt, Indonesia, and someone else. I can't even read it. I have to come over here. Pakistan, sorry. So, you can see these are the 25 most populous countries. There's a general relationship when governments restrict religion and religious freedom, that tends to coincide with higher social hostilities. Well, China is a little bit off the track, but as you can see, China has been going up. Let me play that again. So in 2012, China's social hostilities are much higher than it was in 2007. So this is a great concern because this rise in social hostilities is putting China floating towards a part of the world they don't want to be in, a place like Pakistan. Part of the social hostilities in China are in Tibet, but also in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, a place actually where 2 of my children were born, and I spent many years. So the government policies in these regions are not able to completely lower the tensions, and that's raising a number of questions for China. And if you're following the news, in parts of China, there's been a campaign. Here, a church in Wenzhou was nearly constructed, and then because of what the authorities called zoning issues, it was demolished. This is one day and then the following day after the destruction. So one question I would raise in this certain policies towards religion in places like China is, what is the economic cost of restricting religion or religious freedom? This chart isn't from China, but it's from a study done of 12 congregations in Philadelphia. And they found that on an annual basis, these 12 churches contributed $52 million to the local economy in services and other types of work that they did, education, direct spending, and so forth. So the destruction of a church is not just the loss in the building materials, but it's all the positive things a religious organization carries out. It's education, it's care, the hiring of the people, humanitarian aid work it does. So there is a great cost when you restrict religion, especially benign religion, to the society. Well, I want to get sort of to a couple main points in my talk and sort of bring this around and looking at economics as it relates to religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief. Some of these findings are from a book that you may have seen out on the table, The Price of Freedom Denied, Religious Persecution and Conflict in the 21st Century, a book I wrote with a colleague at Penn State, Roger Finke. And one of the things that we noted in the book is that in countries, this is looking at about 193 countries, what we found is that in countries with religious freedom, you have other freedoms, political freedom, freedom of the press, civil liberties. These are correlations, so they're all significant, but the bigger the pie or the larger the numbers, the stronger the correlation. The fourth strongest correlation was where you have religious freedom, you have better lives for women, gender empowerment. Very interesting. That's something that would not necessarily be expected, because when people think of religion, and I'll get to this, they may think of oppression that comes from a religion, like what's going on in ISIS in this northern part of Iraq and Syria. Well, the other thing that we found, I want to carry on with this gender. This is by the way, this is why 6 is afraid of 7, because 7, 8, 9, all these numbers are very, very scary on this chart, but nowhere nearly as scary as my son's numbers. So, but on this chart, we published this in the American Sociological Review, Roger Finke and I, and we found that government restrictions on religious freedom are the most proximate cause and strongest cause of religious violence. But that's fed by the attempt to have a social monopoly of religion. So when you have a religious group pushing the government to have a monopoly faith, then that tends to set up a cycle of violence as people fight over those privileges. But I only want to talk about one other box on this chart. I could talk about a lot more. Is the very top one, women better off, gender. So as women's lives get better off, that tends to lower social hostilities involving religion or social attempts by religious groups to dominate society coercively. So there's very interesting relationships between how religious freedom relates to other things such as women's empowerment, and how women's empowerment can also help to lower social hostilities that help drive down religious freedom. So perhaps the most disturbing case study is what's going on in Iraq today with ISIS, or the Islamic State, has taken over the northern part of Iraq, pushing on Baghdad. And it's a battle that the outcome is yet not known, whether or not this group will extend its reach further than it has. As it comes in, women's lives are getting worse. And it's really an oppressive situation. But it's important to look at what the ground was like before ISIS was able to make its inroads in Iraq. And I published this recently in a blog at the World Economic Forum. And I looked at Iraq and had some data on it and asked what was the main concern of Iraqis before this Islamic State could sweep in. And this was a poll we had done at the Pew Research Center in 2012, so the year before ISIS was starting to be successful in Iraq. And there were 5 things people listed of their biggest concerns. The 5th one was tribal group conflict. The 4th one was religious group conflict. It wasn't first. Corrupt political leaders and crime were number 2 and 3. What do you think was the biggest concern on the Iraqi public's mind in the year before ISIS attacked?
Jobs, economy.
You got it right. You nailed it. Unemployment. So, a poor economy does not cause religious terrorism. But where you don't have jobs and where you don't have economic development, it's fertile ground for extremism to come in and say, we've got a solution. They certainly didn't. So can you just, imagine if business would have been challenged to think through how they could improve the situation in Iraq, just like the terrorists were thinking, how can we use that bad situation to come in and take over? So this is actually a new a new strategy or a new way of thinking, even a paradigm shift in approaching religious freedom. It's one the United Nations is working on in a platform they call Business for Peace that I've been working with, helping businesses see how what they could do through investment, empowerment, could empower areas that are prone to religious conflict or religious discrimination, empower these groups so that extremism or persecution can't get as strong of a foothold. So before I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth, but I want to give you a few more 6 afraid of 7 numbers. And this is really the most scary chart I have, and I don't expect you to read it. But it's a similar model where we can test to see what leads to GDP growth. And on this chart that you can't read are things like inflation rate, GDP per capita, tariff rate, other kinds of things that can lead to economic growth. And what we found, this was a paper we published earlier this year, is that restrictions on religious freedom drive religious hostilities, and those two in tandem lowered economic growth. This was a study of 140 some countries. So this in no way proves that religious freedom is the solution, is what's needed for economic growth. But what it does say is that if we're thinking about what can help an economy grow, we shouldn't ignore religious freedom. So all it does for me as a researcher is say, oh, this is something I should start looking at a little bit more carefully because it was one of only 3 things that remained significant, controlling for other possible explanations of economic growth. So why is it that religious freedom might help promote growth and economic global competitiveness? At the World Economic Forum, there's 12 pillars of global competitiveness. These are the fundamental aspects of society that are needed to promote and sustain long-term economic growth. And all of these, or 10 of the 12, are significantly higher in countries with respect for religious freedom, and lower in countries where religious freedom is challenged. I'm only going to give a few examples from one, primary education and health and training and innovation. But before I do give that, I'm going to make a mention that of the pillars at the Economic Forum, there's one that is not associated with religious freedom: market size. So the largest markets today are in countries where religious freedom is under threat or has a poor record. So in these countries in the data, countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, China, Indonesia have large markets, but they don't have as strong of protections and practice of respecting religious freedom. So the question I would raise is, can these markets truly develop and be sustainable in the long term without religious freedom? I think that's a question worth asking, because religious freedom promotes things like education and democracy. And this is a very interesting article by Bob Woodbury. Some of you here know him. And it was probably the most rigorously reviewed and criticized article in the American Political Science Review, the leading journal for political science, where he found that the Protestant proselytizing missionary enterprise of the 18th and 19th centuries, or 19th and 20th centuries, led to really the democracy and economic development of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. And much of the world, South America. So if you would, one of the things that he has in his data is that if you take a map of where Protestant missionaries went, and then you overlay that with a satellite map of light of the world today, you'll see a pinpoint of light where Protestant missionaries went. And so that's some evidence that the economy is developed in those places. And he had to rigorously defend this because they said, well, they just went to the places that were prone for development. But actually, the Protestant missionary endeavor was focused on reaching the unreached and pushing inland to places that weren't developed. And again, this was published. So this is part of that education. They took education, they took hospitals. So the religious freedom needed for a missionary enterprise was part of what helped the world develop. I'm not advocating for that as a way to help economies develop in the future, but certainly historically that was important. Well, let me talk about innovation and religious freedom and faith. So innovation is the critical ingredient for future economic success. So if any country just stays where they're at, doing what they're doing, they'll fail. Because the world's changing, anything that's going to grow has to keep innovating. Well, let me give you a few examples. I'm sure you all know the religious history of cornflakes. Does anybody know you do? Okay, don't give it away. So the religious history of cornflakes. Everybody knows cornflakes, right? Well, cornflakes started off as this, toasted cornflakes. The company was Sanitas from Battle Creek, Michigan. And it came about because two brothers, the Kellogg's brothers, were Seventh-day Adventists. If you know anything about them, they believe, they worship on the seventh day, the Sabbath. They follow the Old Testament teachings on diet. And so they don't eat pork. They don't drink wine. And they're nearly vegetarians. And they observed in the late 1900s in the U.S. that Americans, for breakfast, were eating bacon, ham, grease, eggs, all the things that are bad for the temple of the Holy Spirit. That's what they believe. Your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So they said, we've got to do something about it. And they looked around Battle Creek, Michigan, and there were cornfields everywhere. And so they said, let's make something, and they made cornflakes. So because of their freedom to practice their faith and the faith itself, it led to an innovation that's changed the world. You might not think cereal's very healthy, but it was healthier than what they were eating back in the day. Well, this innovation continues. The largest cereal company in Australia, Asia, is Sanitarium. Notice the name. Remember this one, Sanitas, which means health in Latin, well-being. Sanitarium is a company owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And their mission is to provide good nutrition and full well-being to the people of Australia, motivated by their faith. So faith, when given freedom in a society, can motivate innovations. Just another quick example of how it fosters innovation. In Brazil, a Seventh-day Adventist company, they don't drink wine, but they make grape juice, and they had a great crop of grapes one year. And they took that crop and they turned it into a special reserve bottle of grape juice that they sell for 3 times the price, and it's become a bestseller in Brazil. Again, how faith can motivate some innovation. A new cashew company in Mozambique is led by a former vice president of Hershey Foods. He went there because of his faith to have a different business model. He gives back 90% of all profits to Mozambique to help it develop. And now this cashew company that he started on his own is growing to be one of the largest in Mozambique, and it's now being carried by giant food stores, and Whole Foods was talking to him about adopting that. But he had a completely innovative model of giving away his proceeds and sort of basing it on some biblical ideas that he had. And give an example from another faith. In New York City, where the Twin Towers were attacked during 9/11, Muslims are on the streets there running halal shops selling Muslim, Islamic halal food. But people that are lining up city blocks to eat it, and it's not Muslims. It's mostly non-Muslims, and their shop is called the Halal Guys. So the religious, where they have freedom to practice their religion, they can innovate, bring new food. And these are just some ideas that are included in a recent publication I did with the UN, Business, a Powerful Force for Supporting Interfaith Understanding and Peace. And in a couple examples, and then I have a video that I'll show that was part of that case study. In the Philippines, as you know, the south is mostly Muslim, the north is mostly Catholic. And a business in the Philippines is placing Muslims in Catholic businesses in the north so that they can get to see what Muslims are like. And it's bringing innovations to companies, because now Catholic companies from the north are finding out that they can have certain strategies that work in the south that they never thought of. And now big companies actually understand the power of religious divisions to hurt business. Coca-Cola gave in their market in Asia, they have different strategies for different countries. As they were developing their strategy for Pakistan and India, they realized that they could not be successful in one country without hurting their business in the other, because Pakistan and India are technically almost at war, and they've almost come to even nuclear war several times. So the Coke team decided that the best way to sell their product was to approach India and Pakistan as if they were one market, and not make Coke sound like it's a drink that the Muslims in Pakistan drink, or it's a drink that the Hindus in India drink, but it's a drink for all people. So this is what Coca-Cola did, recognizing these religious divisions and trying to bring them together.
The relationship between India and Pakistan is one that has seen a lot of lows.
It's stressful, it's tense. It seems it's not improving and it's getting worse.
It's only been 60 years that we have been apart. Before that, we were living harmoniously together.
I think all the strife would go away if you took away the Baghdad in the middle of the two countries.
It saddens me that we have this neighbor that we can't even go visit.
They had this perception which they ingrained in the head that that's the bad guy. But when they actually meet them, they realize, you know what, just like me.
Mainly because there's no communication. They're near us, but we have no access to them. And it's sad. Because together, I think we would do wonders.
Where young people can exchange ideas, thoughts, gestures, and take away that communication gap that exists.
If I have any opportunity to go to India, I'll surely go there. The whole idea of actually touching hands, it's like communicating with each other without words, and that action speaks louder than anything else.
This is what we're supposed to do, right? We are going to take minor steps so that we are going to solve bigger issues.
It is more about, how similar we are as opposed to how different we are.
Togetherness, humanity, this is what we want. More and more exchange.
So I don't own any Coca-Cola stock. That's not an advertisement for Coke. But this idea that business could be part of a peacemaking endeavor is a very new idea, because when you think of big business, they do a lot of can create a lot of problems around the world, but they also have the potential to do a lot of good. So this new approach to thinking about religious freedom has been changing minds. So as the picture I showed you about the resource with the UN, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, helped us launch it. In Brazil, the Vice President of Brazil, when he started to see this approach, he said, you know, the Brazilian government is here to help in any way we can. We'd love to help support this message. I was in the House of Lords last week meeting with some of the members of Parliament, and you know, people, they hear this message and they think this could really be something that could bring peace to the world. So one of the, I guess the flip that I made in this, and I'll show you one last picture. I'm sorry if I can. Really came about by trying to think through how to address this problem. These are in India, Pakistan, and Nepal. As you know, the Hindus have a caste system, so there's different castes or different, you know, sort of levels of personhood within the Hindu system. And at the very bottom are the untouchables, or the Dalits. And there's 300 million Dalits, and they're considered to have to live through this life at the bottom of the social rung because of their past sins. And the only way that they can advance through reincarnation in the next life is to work through their suffering in this life, suffer, do their duty, and then get reincarnated to a next life. Well, you can imagine that's not a very hopeful situation. And many Dalits in India today, Pakistan and Nepal, have been converting to other faiths, Islam or Christianity. In Pakistan and Nepal in particular, the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Mission has been working to try to lift the Dalits out of their problem and their situation. And so we had a consultation a year or so ago, and they said, well, nothing's working. In fact, there was a woman now on death row in Pakistan who is accused of blasphemy for just saying something negative about Islam. So and churches are being bombed. So there's a great concern for these Dalit communities. And I said, well, you know, what's their condition? They said, well, they're mostly garbage pickers. You know, that's what they do. They pick garbage and they live at the bottom of the rung. And I said, well, you know, if you're a business person and you see that, you think there's a lot of money there. You can recycle that stuff, you can manage that stuff, you can put it in and make energy from it, from the emissions. And immediately, these people, their minds just changed. They said, we can do this. This is something we can do. 2 weeks ago, I was in Helsinki meeting with the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Mission, businesses, the Foreign Ministry of Affairs, Aalto University. And they said, this is a strategy that we think can turn them from being garbage pickers into waste managers and empower them socially. That could be a social solution to what's essentially a religious discrimination problem, but rather than attacking it directly, deal with some of this underlying thing. And at least from my research, I see the interconnectedness of all of these things. So rather than approach religious freedom just as a legal issue or First Amendment issue here in the US, think of it holistically and see what lives we can change. So that's the mission that I'm about, and trying to study how many countries have businesses that help reduce religious restrictions. And I encourage anyone that's interested to check out our website, and we have a newsletter you're welcome to subscribe to, but a new way of thinking. And I think we have now some time to answer questions that I can try to answer questions. Thanks.